The first man I treated that day wasn't screaming. That was what frightened me the most. I'd been serving as a combat medic in Cambodia for nearly a year. And by then I'd learned that the quiet ones were often the ones closest to death. When a wounded soldier stopped crying out, it usually meant he'd lost too much blood, or he no longer had the strength to fight the pain. The radio call came just before sunrise. Medic team, move now. One special operations soldier critically wounded. Riverbank south of the rubber plantation. There was no time to ask questions. I grabbed my medical bag, checked the bandages one last time, and slung a folded stretcher across my shoulder. My canteen, dented from months of marching through flooded trails and rocky paths, knocked against my hip as I ran. Beside me were Wah, our strongest litter bearer, and Loy, a young medic barely 20 years old who still carried the excitement of someone who believed medicine could save everyone. Wah rarely spoke. He kept an old dented canteen because it had belonged to his father. A veteran from another war. No matter how exhausted he became, he never left that canteen behind. Loy was different, curious, optimistic. He often talked about becoming a doctor once the war ended. Inside his pack, next to his malaria tablets, he carried a small notebook filled with anatomy sketches copied by hand whenever we found an old medical textbook. Neither of them complained as we hurried through the damp jungle. The forest smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Mist clung to the trees, and every step sank into soft mud. Somewhere above us, unseen birds called into the fading darkness. When we reached the rendezvous point, 4 special operations soldiers were waiting. One of them lay motionless on the ground. His uniform was soaked with blood from a deep wound across his lower chest and shoulder. His breathing came in shallow gasps. A teammate pressed both hands against the wound, trying desperately to slow the bleeding. He made it back from the river. Their team leader said quietly, "But he won't survive much longer." I dropped beside the wounded man without another word. The smell of blood mixed with the sharp sting of antiseptic as I opened my medical pouch. My fingers worked automatically, cutting away the torn fabric, packing the wound with sterile gauze, wrapping pressure bandages as tightly as I dared. His pulse was weak. Too weak. Loy, morphine. He handed me the syringe immediately. Wah, get the stretcher ready. Within seconds the wounded soldier was secured onto the folding litter. His face remained pale, his lips turning slightly blue. I checked his pulse again. Still fading. We had only one small IV bag left. Only one. Our resupply convoy hadn't reached us for nearly a week. Every roll of gauze, every bottle of disinfectant, every vial of medicine had become precious. I silently prayed that this single bag would keep him alive long enough to reach the field hospital. Around us, the special operations team remained unusually tense. These men were veterans. Nothing rattled them easily. Yet every pair of eyes kept scanning the tree line instead of watching their wounded brother. Finally, their commander crouched beside me. "We're moving immediately," he whispered. I looked up. "Enemy?" He nodded once. "Our scouts found fresh tracks." He paused before adding words that made every man around us instinctively tighten his grip on his weapon. "They believe the old Pon Pot commander is somewhere ahead." No one spoke after that. The jungle suddenly felt much quieter than before. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared. We lifted the stretcher. Step by step, we disappeared into the trees, carrying a wounded soldier whose life depended on us, while somewhere ahead, an experienced enemy commander was already waiting for us to make our next move. We had 2 choices. One path cut straight through a low stretch of flooded jungle and would get us to the field station before noon if luck stayed with us. The other swung wide around the tree line. Safer in theory, but almost twice as long. The wounded commando on the stretcher didn't have twice as long. I checked his pulse while Wah and Loy shifted the litter poles on their shoulders. His skin felt cold and damp beneath my fingers. His breathing came in short, uneven pulls, like every breath had to be dragged out of the mud. "He's slipping," Loy whispered. I looked at the IV bag hanging from a bamboo stick Wah had cut with his knife. The fluid was already halfway gone. That little clear bag looked smaller than any hope I had ever held in my hands. The Special Operations Commander studied the trail ahead. He was a lean man with tired eyes. The kind of soldier who didn't waste words. His men waited for him in silence. AK rifles held low. Faces painted with mud and sweat. "We take the short route," he said at last. Nobody argued. But I remember Wah glancing at me. He didn't say it, yet I knew what he was thinking. A short road in Cambodia was rarely a gift. Sometimes it was bait. We moved in a thin line. 2 commandos went first, stepping carefully through knee-deep water. Then came Wah and another soldier carrying the front of the stretcher. I stayed beside the wounded man, one hand holding the IV line, the other pressed near the bandage to feel whether blood was soaking through. Loy followed close behind with my medical bag, his young face too serious for his age. The jungle closed around us. The air smelled of wet leaves, old smoke, and that sour stink of swamp water that never left your clothes. Mosquitoes swarmed around our ears. Leeches clung to our socks. Every now and then, someone's boot sank too deep and made a sucking sound in the mud. We stopped once under a cluster of broad leaves to let the men rest their shoulders. Wah opened his dented canteen and took one small sip, then handed it to Loy. "Drink," he said. Loy shook his head. "Save it for him." Wah didn't smile. "You pass out, he dies too." That was Wah. Rough words. Good heart. I tore open a small packet of dried rice and forced a few bites down. It tasted like dust and smoke. War taught a man to eat without hunger, sleep without comfort, and keep moving even when his legs felt borrowed from someone else. The wounded commando stirred. His eyes opened just enough to see me. "Don't let them leave me," he murmured. I leaned closer. "Nobody's leaving you." He swallowed hard. "River team, report. Save your breath." But he kept trying to speak. That was when I understood. He wasn't afraid of dying as much as he was afraid his mission would die with him. Before I could ask more, the lead scout raised his fist. Everyone froze. The jungle went still in a way I did not like. No birds, no insects, not even the soft chatter of monkeys in the high branches. The commander crouched near a patch of mud. There were footprints there, fresh ones, partly filled with brown water. Bare feet and sandals. More than one man. He touched a broken reed, then looked toward the darker part of the trail. "They're close," he said. Loy's hand tightened around the medical bag strap. Behind us, the wounded man's breathing grew worse. Ahead of us, somewhere beyond the flooded trees, the old Pon Pot commander was waiting. And we had already chosen the road that could not turn back. The first sign was not a shot. It was a silence. I had heard many kinds of silence in Cambodia. There was the tired silence of men too hungry to talk, the heavy silence before rain, the cold silence after a man stopped breathing in your hands. But this one was different. It felt arranged, like the jungle itself had been ordered to hold its breath. The lead commando knelt near the waterline and studied the mud. He did not touch anything at first. He only looked. Then he pointed with 2 fingers. A vine had been cut. Not torn, not snapped by accident. Cut cleanly, with a blade sharp enough to leave the end smooth and pale. A few steps farther, a broken branch leaned across the trail at chest height. Too obvious, too careless. The commander saw it and gave a dry, humorless smile. "He wants us to see that," he whispered. I knew who he meant. The old Pon Pot commander. By then, I had heard stories about him from men who had spent months moving through those forests. Nobody knew his real name. Some called him the Old Fox. He was not feared because he was brave in a charge. He was feared because he waited. He let tired men choose wrong. He used hunger, heat, fear, and wounded bodies the way other commanders used bullets. And now we were carrying exactly what he wanted us to carry, a wounded man on a stretcher. Bleeding, slowing us down, forcing us to make fast decisions. Wah shifted his grip on the stretcher pole. His shirt was soaked through, and mud had climbed almost to his waist. Still, his eyes stayed steady. "Doc," he muttered, "how much time does he have?" I looked down at the wounded commando. His face had gone gray. The bandage over his shoulder and chest was dark again. Blood had pushed through the gauze despite the pressure wrap. I pressed my fingers to his neck and found the pulse. Thin and weak. "Not enough," I said. Loy swallowed hard behind me. He opened the medical bag and searched for more gauze. Though we both knew there wasn't much left. His hands were quick, but I could see the fear in them. He was young enough to still believe that if he worked fast enough, death might lose patience and leave. The Special Operations Commander raised his fist again. We froze. Ahead of us, half hidden in the mud, lay a small wooden stake with wire tied around its base. It looked like the trigger for a trap, but it sat too exposed. Any careless soldier would notice it. That made it worse. The commander crouched low, studying the ground around it. "Decoy," he breathed. No one moved. A real trap would be somewhere else. That was the game. Show one danger, hide another. Make a man so proud of seeing the first trick that he stepped right into the second. I felt sweat crawl down my back though the air was cool under the trees. Behind us, the wounded man suddenly coughed. A wet, painful sound. I bent over him, afraid he was choking on blood. I turned his head gently and wiped his mouth with a strip of cloth. The smell of iron, antiseptic, and swamp mud rose together. "Stay with me," I whispered. "You hear me? Stay with me." His eyelids fluttered. Somewhere ahead, water moved. Just once. A soft ripple, too small for a man to notice unless every nerve in his body was already listening. The commander's eyes narrowed. The jungle remained still. Nobody fired. Nobody spoke. That was when I understood the fight had already begun. Not with bullets, but with patience. The old Pon Pot commander was waiting for us to hurry. Our commander was waiting for him to reveal where death had been hidden. And between them lay my patient, fading breath by breath on a bamboo stretcher. The commando commander did not order anyone to fire. That was the first thing I noticed. A younger officer might have sprayed the tree line with bullets, hoping fear would clear the way. But this man understood the jungle better than that. In a place like Cambodia, a rifle shot could tell the enemy everything: your position, your fear, even how many men you had left. So we waited. The stretcher rested across two wet logs while Wah crouched beside it. One hand still wrapped around the pole as if the wounded man might fall through the earth if he let go. Loy knelt close to me, holding my medical bag open. His eyes kept moving between the patient and the dark water ahead. "Doc," he whispered, "his bandage is soaked again." I nodded. I had already seen it. The blood had spread through the gauze in a slow, ugly circle. I cut away the outer wrap as quietly as I could, careful not to let the metal scissors click against my canteen. Even the smallest sound felt dangerous. The smell of disinfectant rose from my hands. Sharp, clean, out of place in all that mud and rot. The wounded commando opened his eyes. "Where are we?" he breathed. "Still moving," I whispered. "You just rest." He tried to turn his head. I pressed a hand gently against his shoulder. "Don't move." His skin was burning now. That worried me almost as much as the bleeding. "Fever," Loy said, touching the man's forehead. I looked at him. He knew what it meant. Blood loss was bad enough. Infection, shock, and fever could turn a fighting man into a corpse before sunset. We had quinine tablets for malaria, a few painkillers, some bandages, iodine, and almost nothing else worth calling medicine. I packed the wound again. Deeper this time. The commando clenched his jaw but did not cry out. Special operations men were trained to disappear into rivers, carry explosives, breathe through reeds, and move like shadows, but no training made pain gentle. A few yards away, the commander studied the water. Then he made a small hand signal. One of his men picked up a dry branch and tossed it toward the visible trap. The branch landed with a soft splash. Nothing happened. Nobody relaxed. The commander's eyes stayed fixed on the reeds farther left. That was when I saw it too. A ripple moved against the current. Not from fish, not from wind. Someone was in that water, or had been there seconds before. My mouth went dry. The old Pon Pot commander was not trying to stop us at the obvious trap. He was trying to make us look at it long enough to forget the water. The commando commander leaned close to me. How long can he wait? I looked at the man on the stretcher. His breathing had grown shallow again. His pulse fluttered beneath my fingers. Weak and fast. Not long, I said. The commander's face did not change, but I saw the weight of it settle on him. If he moved too soon, we could walk into a hidden kill zone. If he waited too long, the man I was treating would die right there in the mud. That was the kind of choice war gave you. No clean answer. No time to pray over it. Just a wounded man, a silent jungle, and death hiding somewhere beyond the reeds. The commander raised one finger. No one moved. Then he whispered so softly I almost missed it. From now on, not one sound. I had only one IV bag left. That was the truth I kept trying not to look at. It hung from Hoa's bamboo stick, half empty now, swaying gently above the wounded commando like a small piece of sky trapped in plastic. Every drop sliding through that clear tube felt like borrowed time. Loy looked at the bag, then at me. He did not say anything at first. He didn't have to. We both knew what it meant. If I used the rest of it on this man, there would be nothing left for the next casualty. No fluid for shock, no second chance if Loy, or one of the commandos went down in the next few minutes. In war, medicine was never just medicine. It was a choice. The wounded commando's pulse was racing now, weak and uneven under my fingers. His lips had gone pale. Sweat covered his forehead even though the air had cooled under the trees. His body was fighting, but it was fighting with almost nothing left. "Doc," Loy whispered, "maybe we should save some." I looked at him. He was not being selfish. He was being responsible. That was the cruel part. A good medic had to think about the living man in front of him and the men who might be wounded 5 minutes from now. Compassion alone could get people killed, but too much calculation could make you forget why you carried the Red Cross bag in the first place. The jungle stayed silent around us. Somewhere ahead, the old Pon Pot commander was waiting for us to make a mistake. He did not need to rush. He knew we had a stretcher. He knew we had a bleeding man. He knew time was already cutting into us deeper than any knife. I pulled the bandage tighter across the commando's chest. He groaned through clenched teeth. "Stay with me," I said. His eyes opened halfway. "Don't waste it on me," he whispered. For a second, no one moved. Even Wad turned his head. The wounded man tried to breathe again. "If I slow you down." I leaned close to his face, close enough to smell blood, mud, and the bitter sting of iodine. "You don't get to decide that," I told him. "Not today." He stared at me, too weak to answer. I had heard men say brave things before. Some meant it, some were just scared and trying to leave the world with dignity. But this man was different. He was not trying to be a hero. He was trying to protect the team, even while death was sitting on his chest. That made the decision harder. I looked at Wah. He gave me one small nod. His face was tired, dirty, and unreadable, but his eyes were steady. Loy's hands trembled slightly as he held the medical bag open. "Full line," I said. Loy swallowed. "All of it?" "All of it." He obeyed. I adjusted the tube and watched the remaining fluid begin to run faster. The bag slowly collapsed on itself. I remember that sound clearly, the soft crinkle of plastic in a silent jungle. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. To me, it sounded like a door closing behind us. There was no more safety after that. No backup. No reserve. Just our hands, our training, and whatever courage we still had left. For a few minutes, the commando's breathing steadied. Not much, just enough for me to believe we had bought him a little more road. Then the commander crawled back to us, his face close to the mud. "We move in 30 seconds. He whispered. No talking, no metal noise, no sudden steps. Wah tightened his grip on the stretcher pole. Loy zipped the empty medical pouch with painful care. I looked once more at the flattened IV bag. I had saved one man for the moment. But if the jungle opened fire, I had nothing left to save the next. We started moving like men walking across thin ice. No one spoke, no one coughed. Even the wounded commando seemed to understand that his breathing had become part of our concealment. Each step had to be placed slowly. Heel first, then the edge of the foot, then weight. Wah carried the front of the stretcher with another commando. I walked beside the wounded man, one hand near his bandage, the other holding the empty IV tube so it would not swing and catch on brush. Loy followed behind me with the medical bag hugged tight to his chest. The Special Operations Commander led from the side, not the front. That told me he was thinking like the old Pol Pot commander. He was not trying to find the enemy where the enemy wanted to be seen. He was watching the places a patient man would choose: low ground, water pockets, roots wide enough to hide wire, bushes thick enough to cover a rifle barrel. Then he stopped. A single reed in the water had bent the wrong way. That was all. To most men, it would have meant nothing. To him, it was a sentence written by an enemy hand. He slowly raised two fingers and pointed left. One commando slid into position behind a fallen tree. Another shifted toward the right, careful not to splash. Still no gunfire. It felt less like a battle than a chess match played in mud. Blood, and silence. Then a shot cracked from the far bank. It did not hit anyone. It struck a tree above us, sending wet bark into the air. The wounded man flinched on the stretcher. Wah lowered his shoulder to keep the poles steady. Loy dropped flat into the mud but kept the medical bag under his body so it would not get soaked. The commander did not return fire right away. That surprised me. He waited. A second shot came from a different spot. Now I understood. The old Pol Pot commander was trying to make us turn toward the gunfire. He wanted the stretcher team to bunch up, panic, and run into the real trap. The bullets were not meant to kill us yet. They were meant to steer us. The commando commander whispered something to the man beside him. A moment later, one of our soldiers fired a short burst from his AK toward a clump of trees far to the right, not where the shots had come from. Leaves exploded. A dark figure moved for half a second behind the reeds. That was the first time I saw fear pass through the enemy's plan. They knew we had not taken the bait. "Move," the commander hissed. We lifted the stretcher and pushed forward. The mud grabbed at our boots. Branches clawed at our sleeves. The wounded man's bandage darkened again. But I could not stop to change it. All I could do was press my palm over the wound and walk beside him, feeling warm blood seep between my fingers. Another burst of gunfire snapped from the trees. Wah grunted. The front of the stretcher dipped. For one terrible second, I thought the wounded man was going to fall. "Wah," I whispered. He caught himself, jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out in his face. A strip of red opened across his shoulder. Not deep, but enough to weaken his arm. "I'm fine," he said through his teeth. He was lying. Everyone knew it. But he kept carrying. That was Wah. He had no speeches in him. No big words about courage. He just held on. Behind us, the enemy fired again, angrier now, less patient. The old commander's quiet game had begun to break apart, but not enough to save us yet. We had escaped the first move. But the stretcher was heavier. Wah was bleeding, and I had nothing left in my bag that could replace blood. Wah said he was fine, but his left shoulder told a different story. Blood ran down his sleeve and mixed with the mud on his forearm. Each time the stretcher bounced, his face tightened for half a second before he forced it blank again. Men like Wah did not ask for help. That was what made them dangerous to themselves. We moved another 50 yards before his knees buckled. The front of the stretcher dropped hard. The wounded commando let out a low groan, and the bandage across his chest opened fresh again. I caught the side of the litter before it tipped, but for one terrifying moment I saw both of them slipping away from me, one bleeding on the stretcher, the other standing beside it, too stubborn to fall. "Down," I whispered. "Set him down now." The commander turned, eyes sharp. "We can't stop here. I need 3 minutes." "We may not have 3 minutes." That was the truth. Gunfire still cracked behind us. Not constant, but close enough to remind us the old Pon Pot commander was still pressing the blade in. He no longer had full surprise, but he had patience. He knew a stretcher team could only move so fast. He knew every wound slowed us more than a bullet had to. Lloyd dropped beside Wah and opened the medical bag. "We have almost no gauze," he said. "Use cloth." He looked at me. "From where?" I pulled my own scarf from around my neck. It was damp with sweat and jungle water, but it was the cleanest thing I had left. I tore it into strips with my teeth and handed them to him. Wah tried to push my hands away. "Save it for him," he muttered, nodding toward the commando. I grabbed his wrist and held it still. "You lose that arm, we lose the stretcher. We lose the stretcher, he dies. So stop arguing." For once, Wah listened. I cleaned the wound fast with a little iodine. The smell cut through the damp jungle air, sharp enough to make my eyes sting. The bullet fragment had sliced across the top of his shoulder. Shallow but ugly, not fatal, not even close, but every step would tear it wider if I did not bind it tight. Loy wrapped the cloth while I checked the commando again. His breathing had turned rough. His chest rose unevenly. The fever was still there, burning under his skin. I pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Weak pulse. Too fast. I wanted to stay. I wanted to change the packing. Cool his fever. Give him fluids I no longer had. And make the kind of careful decisions doctors make under bright lights with clean instruments. But war did not give us clean instruments. War gave us mud, fear, and a clock no one could see. Behind me, one of the commandos said, "Doc, we need to dump weight." He meant supplies, maybe spare ammunition, maybe even the stretcher frame if it came to that. Loy looked at me, then at the medical bag. "There are extra malaria tablets, some dried rice, bandage wrappers, the empty bottle. Throw the wrappers, keep the tablets." He hesitated. "They're heavy. So is a fever when it gets into a whole unit." That was the thing people forget about medics. We did not only treat wounds. We fought sickness before it could take more men than bullets did. Malaria had emptied more hammocks than some firefights I remembered. The commander crouched beside me. "Can he move?" I looked at Wah. His jaw was clenched, but he nodded once. Then I looked at the man on the stretcher. He was barely conscious, but alive. "We move," I said, "but slower for the first stretch." The commander stared at me. "Slower gets us killed. Too fast kills them both." For a second, The jungle held its breath again. Then he gave a short nod. That was the choice. Not safe. Not wise. Just the least cruel path left. Wall lifted the stretcher again with his good shoulder taking more weight than it should have. Loy moved beside him now, helping balance the pole. I stayed close to the wounded commando. My palm pressed over the bandage, feeling his heartbeat fight beneath my hand. We had lost time. We had lost supplies. But we had not left anyone behind. Not yet. The rain came hard, as if the sky had been waiting for the worst possible moment. 1 minute the jungle was breathing heat into our faces. The next, water crashed through the leaves in heavy sheets, turning dust to paste and mud to soup. It soaked our uniforms, ran down our necks, and blurred the tree line until the whole world became gray and green. For us, it was misery. For the commando commander, it was a chance. He crouched beside the stretcher and wiped rain from his eyes. When the next burst comes, he whispered, we shift left, slow, no panic. Hoa's wounded shoulder sagged under the pole, but he nodded. Loy moved beside him, ready to take more weight if he had to. I stayed near the wounded commando's chest, pressing my palm over the soaked bandage. His breathing had changed again. Too shallow. Too fast. I lowered my ear close to his mouth. Stay with me, I said. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The next burst of gunfire tore through the rain. The commandos answered, but not wildly. 2 short bursts from AK rifles snapped from our right, drawing the enemy's eyes away from the stretcher. At the same time, we shifted left through a curtain of rain and hanging vines. The old Pon Pot commander had tried to use silence against us. Now our commander used noise, water, and confusion against him. For the first time, I heard enemy voices ahead. Sharp calls, angry, uncertain. That was when I knew the mind game had changed. The old fox was no longer waiting calmly for us to step into his trap. He was trying to find us again. We moved another 20 yards. Then 30. Every step felt endless. The stretcher dug into Hoa's injured shoulder. Loy's face had gone pale from the strain. My hands were numb from holding pressure on the wound. Then the wounded commando's body jerked. His back arched slightly. His eyes rolled beneath half-closed lids. Shock, I said. Loy looked at me, rain running off his chin. What do we do? I wanted to say, give fluids. But the IV bag was empty. I wanted to say, get him warm. But everything we owned was soaked. I wanted to say, we stop and work. But stopping could kill everyone. So I did what battlefield medicine often became, the smallest useful thing left. I checked his airway, turned his head slightly, loosened the wrap where it pressed too hard, then packed the wound tighter with the last clean strip I had. I put my hand on his chest, not because it was enough, but because sometimes a dying man needed to feel that someone was still there fighting with him. Breathe, I told him, just breathe. Behind us, the firing began to fade. Not stop. Fade. There is a difference. Stopping can mean another ambush. Fading means distance. The commando commander listened for a long moment, then raised his hand. We halted under a thick stand of trees. The rain softened the jungle sounds around us, and for the first time in what felt like hours, nobody fired. Wall lowered the stretcher with a quiet groan. Loy sat back in the mud, exhausted, still clutching the medical bag like it was a child. No one cheered. No one said we had won. Men who have truly been close to death do not celebrate too loudly. They just breathe and count who is still there. The old Pon Pot commander had pulled back, or maybe he had simply chosen not to spend more men in the rain. I never learned which. War leaves many questions unanswered. But our problem had not ended. The field station was still miles away. Our medicine was nearly gone. and the man on the stretcher was alive only by the thinnest thread I had ever held. We reached the field station after dark. Calling it a station made it sound bigger than it was. In truth, it was a stretch of ground under torn canvas, hidden beneath thick trees, with a few bamboo tables, 2 kerosene lamps, and more wounded men than space. Rain dripped from the edges of the tarps. The floor was mud packed down by boots, stretchers, and bare knees. But to us, that place looked like civilization. The moment we carried the commando in, 2 orderlies cleared a table. Wah helped lift the stretcher even though his wounded shoulder had stiffened so badly he could barely raise his arm. Lloyd dropped the medical bag beside me and began pulling out whatever was left, some gauze, iodine, fever tablets, a roll of tape almost gone, and a pair of scissors darkened by rust. The field doctor looked at the commando's chest, then at me. "How long?" "Since before sunrise," I said. His face tightened, but he did not waste breath blaming anyone. There was no room for blame in that tent, only work. We cut away the soaked bandages. The smell rose immediately: blood, disinfectant, wet cloth, and jungle mud. It is a smell I still remember better than the smell of my own childhood home. Some memories enter through the nose and never leave. The wound was worse than I had allowed myself to believe on the trail. The doctor worked under the weak lamp while I held pressure and Lloyd passed supplies with both hands. Wah sat on an ammunition crate nearby, pale from pain, still refusing to lie down. "Bandage him," I told Lloyd, nodding toward Wah. Wah shook his head. "After him." I turned on him sharper than I meant to. "You carried him here. Now let somebody carry you for once." He looked away, embarrassed, but he let Lloyd clean the wound. That was as close to surrender as Wah ever came. The commando drifted in and out through the night. Sometimes he whispered about the river. Sometimes he asked for men who were not there. Once, he grabbed my sleeve so hard his fingers left marks in the mud on my skin. "Report got through?" he asked. I did not know. So I gave him the only answer a medic could give without breaking a man. "You did your part. Rest now." Outside, the jungle kept talking. Rainwater fell from leaves. Insects buzzed around the lamps. Somewhere far away, a single shot cracked and then disappeared into the wet dark. Nobody in the tent lifted his head. By then, we were too tired to be startled. Near midnight, fever took him hard. His body shook on the table, and we had to hold him down so he would not tear open the wound again. Lloyd crushed fever tablets and mixed them with a little water from Hoa's dented canteen. The canteen passed from hand to hand like something sacred. The doctor looked at me once. No words. Just that look all medical men know. "We may lose him." I kept wiping the commando's face with a damp cloth. I kept checking his pulse. I kept listening for breath. There was nothing heroic about it. It was small work, repeated again and again, because sometimes that is how you fight death, not with one great act, but with 100 stubborn little ones. Toward dawn, the rain stopped. The tent became quiet except for breathing. I was sitting beside the table, half asleep, when I felt something touch my wrist. The commando's hand. Weak, cold, but alive. His eyes opened just a little. I leaned close. He did not speak, he only squeezed my hand once. That was enough. After a whole day of mud, blood, fear, and that old Pon Pot commander waiting in the trees, that single squeeze felt like the first honest victory we had been given. The commando lived. Not because we were better than death, and not because war showed mercy. He lived because too many tired hands refused to let go at the same time. The field doctor worked until his eyes turned red from smoke and lack of sleep. Loy sat beside the table and counted breaths like a man counting coins he could not afford to lose. Wah, with his own shoulder wrapped in my torn scarf, kept heating water and passing clean cloths until someone finally ordered him to lie down. By the third morning, the commando opened his eyes fully. He did not say anything brave. He did not ask about medals or revenge or the old Pon Pot commander. He only looked around the canvas shelter, saw that he was still among our men, and whispered, "Water." Wall laughed once under his breath. It was the first laugh I had heard from him in days. He lifted his dented canteen and held it carefully to the man's lips. The commando drank 2 small swallows and closed his eyes again, exhausted by that little victory. That was how survival often looked in Cambodia. Not flags waving, not music, just a wounded soldier taking water without choking. A few days later, we heard that the report from the river team had reached headquarters. Their mission had mattered after all. I never learned the full details. A medic was not told everything. My job was to keep men alive long enough for their stories to continue, even if I never got to hear the ending. As for the old Pon Pot commander, I never saw his face. None of us did. Maybe he slipped deeper into the jungle. Maybe another unit caught up with him months later. Maybe he died nameless in a ditch. Like so many men in that war, I used to think not knowing would bother me forever. It did not. What stayed with me was not him. It was Hoa's handshaking as he held the stretcher anyway. It was Loy crushing fever tablets with the serious face of a boy trying to become a doctor in the middle of hell. It was the smell of iodine under a leaking tarp, the weight of an empty IV bag, the sound of rain hiding gunfire, and that weak squeeze on my wrist near dawn. Years passed. We came home, though not all of us came home whole. Wah returned to his village and worked repairing boats along a muddy river. His shoulder never healed right. When the weather changed, he said it burned like a coal under the skin. Loy kept his promise. He studied medicine after the war and became a doctor in a small district clinic. He wrote to me once that the first baby he delivered cried so loudly it made him sit down and weep. I understood. After years of listening for men's last breaths, a newborn's first cry can break something open inside you. I became an old man before I realized that peace is not silence. Peace has ordinary sounds. A kettle boiling, children arguing in the street, rain on a tin roof without artillery behind it. For a long time, I could not enjoy those sounds. Part of me was still in that wet Cambodian jungle, one hand pressed against a bandage, waiting for the next shot. Wah died many years later. Before he passed, he sent me his old dented canteen. There is still a dark stain near the bottom seam. Maybe mud, maybe rust, maybe blood. I never tried to clean it. It sits on my desk now. When my grandchildren ask why I keep such an ugly thing, I tell them it belonged to a man who carried other men when he could barely carry himself. And when I hold it, I remember the truth that war taught me at a terrible price. Some victories are not measured by ground taken or enemies defeated. Some victories are measured by the number of brothers who made it home alive.